All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to week three. This week, we're going to start looking at causes of terrorism. Now, admittedly, this chapter could probably be an entire course unto itself, but we'll kind of work through it as best we can. We're going to stay pretty broad uh, here, I think. First, it's important to acknowledge, that causes and inspiration for terrorism come from many different sources. It's really hard to say this causes terrorism or this causes terrorism. There's a lot of different reasons why people participate in terrorism. Kind of the first place to start with this topic is you have to recognize that terrorism can be caused at a national level, group level, or an individual level. Okay, so at the national level, we're talking about how nations can be victimized by a traumatic event, such as an invasion or a terrorist attack. Uh, it then shapes their behavior and their culture, for an extended period of time. The group level, terrorism can grow out of a group's political activism. When a group attempts to direct attention toward particular grievances, it can also grow out of a dramatic event. Um, Groups are oftentimes, or sometimes at least, part of a social movement, which are campaigns to try to either promote change, or preserve something perceived to be threatened. Um, Social movements aren't inherently uh, violent, though it's important to make that distinction. But sometimes groups do emerge out of social movements. And these movements, they require mass action, on behalf of a cause. That's why you have marches and you have all these things. All those are oftentimes part of movements. At the individual level, you have stuff rational, psychological, cultural causes of terrorism. A rational terrorist, they're essentially making a cost-benefit analysis of the use of terrorism. What are the costs of doing it? What are the benefits of doing it? Is it worth it? Okay. Psychological motives, derive from terrorist personal dissatisfaction, with their life or their accomplishments. Cultural determinants, is kind of this perception of outsiders, and the outsider threat to the group or the individual's survival. Because there's so many different causes of terrorism, you're really discussing every individual one would be literally impossible. So the book identifies kind of three broad common categories: political violence as strategic choice, political violence as the fruit of injustice, and moral justifications for political violence. All right, so first, political violence is a strategic choice. Okay, this discusses uh, how terrorism is a deliberate strategy made by a choice. Okay, so there's two main concepts here that are important: acts of political will and disparate perspectives on terrorism by the two adversaries. So an act of political will is essentially an effort to force change and consists of these strategic choices made to pursue victory simply as a sheer force of will. Okay, it is the choice made to adopt certain strategies, tactics, and methodologies. The second perspective refers more to the political environment within which the terrorism occurs. Okay, and probably one of the easiest ways to talk about this is talk a little bit about 9/11. Okay, so when 9/11 happened, Americans and Western countries all viewed it as an assault on Western style civilization. The subsequent war on terror was viewed, really as necessary to defend the Western way of life. However, if you look at those, in the Muslim world, uh, many viewed it very differently. Okay, and the argument is that the behavior of Western countries, rather than their actual culture, may have led to the 9/11 attacks. So, in order to fully understand, these types of events, you have to analyze them from both perspectives. All right, political violence is fruit of injustice. So, explanations for this perspective come from sociological, psychological, and criminological perspectives. Okay, sociological explanations generally hold terrorism is a result of intergroup conflict that results in collective violence. So you have conflict between groups, you end up with violence. Okay, terrorism is a group-based phenomenon and is chosen because it's really the only available option for the weaker group. The weaker group can't fight back other than to use terrorism. And oftentimes uh, terrorism is viewed as irrational or senseless, right? Um, but if you think about it from the group that's actually doing the terrorism, to them it may be completely rational. Okay, whoever's being done to, or those the onlookers looking at it, they may think, man, this doesn't make any sense at all. It seems to be irrational or senseless. Um, but for the group doing it, it may be completely rational because they're choosing this particular thing. They're choosing to use terrorism, uh, and they're directing it, to achieve their goals. Structural theory is used um, a lot of times in sociological studies of terrorism to identify social conditions that affect group access to services, equal rights, civil protections, freedom, other quality of life measures. And since the state, or state by state mean government, or the country, whatever, is responsible for a lot of these social structures, they are then the recipient of terrorism in cases that are explained by this theory. So you have groups um, that either don't have access to services, they don't have equal rights, they don't feel like they have any civil protections, they're being suppressed somehow by the state. Um, so then they use terrorism against the state um, because of their lack of access to these things. So that's structural theory. Relative deprivation theory argues that the feelings of deprivation and frustration underlie decisions to partake in collective action or terrorism. Okay, so you have this gap between what's achieved and what's expected, in their well-being, and that breeds resentment, discontent. So you have groups or people that are feeling they're relatively deprived when they compare themselves to others. Okay, which is different from absolute deprivation, and that's when a group has been completely deprived of the basic necessities for survival by the government or social order. Okay, because they've been deprived of these things, people or groups will sometimes engage in violence to obtain those items. Okay, and there's cases related to this in the book. Make sure you familiarize yourself with those. All right, chronological explanations. They argue that the uh, explanations for terrorism are similar to those that are for regular crime. Okay, so one that's used is differential association theory. Hopefully, most of you have had a crim theory course, but differential association theory states that people learn criminal, or in this case, terrorist behavior, from their associations with other people and their socialization by them. Okay, so essentially, they're learning terrorism from the people that they're hanging around with. Enemy and strain theory, those state that society encourages members to use acceptable means to achieve acceptable goals, right? So this is an acceptable goal. These are the means that it's acceptable to try to attain those goals. But same opportunities for achieving goals are not always available to everyone. So then sometimes people will use illegitimate means to try to achieve their goals. That's enemy and strain. Then routine activities theory states that political extremism requires that you have a steady stream of motivated offenders, you have attractive victims, and targets of opportunity are readily available. And there's really no presence or a lack of presence of social guardians. Okay, so that's how routine activities theory explains terrorism. There's also some that use uh, critical criminological theories. I'm not going to get into those really here, but make sure you read it in the book. Psychological explanations for terrorism. All right, so there's kind of this commonly held belief that those who commit terrorism suffer from some form of mental illness. Okay, because most people don't look at terrorist behavior as being rational. Um, and you look at some of this stuff, and you're like, you flew a plane into a building. Surely, there's something mentally going on there that is different, right? Well, they really haven't found that. There's obviously psychological processes at play, but um, generally speaking, sanity and irrationality, psychopathology, there's just not much evidence for that among those that commit terrorism. So there's three kind of main types of psychological explanations: group, individual, and generalized. Okay, so at the group level, these theories try to explain how group dynamics support the use of terrorism. Okay, groups engage in groupthink, where everyone in the group is expected to think the same way, and then there's no compromise. You cannot reject the group's ideals. None of that is allowed. If you do any of that, you're out. Um, People also want to be part of a group, and then the group puts extra pressure on people to make them conform to whatever the group wants them to do. Groups also oftentimes will kind of create these unattainable goals. Okay, and they do that, through rationalizing the use of violence, rationalizing what's going on in the world, and because these goals are unattainable, the group continues to have a reason to exist. If a group had set some goals and they achieved those goals, well, then the group's over, right? I talk about this in organizations some, but when you have a group or you have an organization, the main goal of that group or organization is to exist. So groups will, set these goals real high to where they can't ever really be attained. So the group continues to have a reason to exist. All right, individual level. These psychological explanations uh, center around people's life events. Okay, so they have these events that happen to them in their life that leads to having antisocial feelings, and they seek to improve their environment or their surroundings, or get revenge or redress some kind of grievances. Um, and what it does is it creates this us versus them mentality, where they then attribute evil motivations or intentions on those that they perceive as responsible for those life events that happen to them, or that just simply don't agree with them or adhere to their worldview. So by assigning evil intentions to people, or making people you don't agree with evil, it makes it a whole lot easier to dehumanize them. And then once they're dehumanized, it makes it a whole lot easier to use violence against them because they're no longer viewed as a person. They're viewed as this other, as evil, right? That's got to be eliminated. So again, not much evidence of widespread psychopathology, because when they look at backgrounds uh, of terrorists, they don't often differ from people that don't commit violence. Just straight backgrounds. Like, there may be similarities with other extremists, but they don't find a lot of differences between those that choose to do terrorism versus those that don't choose to be terrorism or to be terrorists. Um, there is some evidence. There is some evidence of certain kind of psychosocial kind of commonalities among violent extremists. A lot of them come from fragmented homes. They suffer some kind of severe conflict. Oftentimes, is with parents. There's some kind of getting in trouble when they're juveniles, conviction in juvenile court, and a pattern of failure educationally and vocationally. So they don't do well in school. They have a hard time keeping jobs. Um, Now, these aren't 100%, right? But these are some commonalities that they find. Generalized psychological explanations, are kind of the broad approaches to the topic. So, they explain terrorism's a choice between violent and less violent alternatives, and the terrorist is the one that rationally chooses that. The terrorist decides, what they're going to do. Terrorism is a technique to maintain group cohesion and focus, uh, where solidarity is more important than individualism. Uh, Terrorism is necessary to build the esteem of an oppressed people. Through terrorism, the weak become strong, and they're able to establish power over those that they view as oppressing them. Terrorists also consider themselves to be an elite vanguard because they know the truth, right? Truth cannot be debated. And then finally, terrorism provides a means to justify political violence. They depersonalize targets, they put symbolic attachments on them. So then you end up with stuff like symbolic buildings, becoming legitimate targets, even to the point where if they're occupied by people, those individual victims, those people within the building, become further symbols of the oppressive system. All right, moral justifications. Okay, so as mentioned previously, terrorists believe they're pursuing a cause as righteous, right? And this cause is above reproach. That's a moral justification. Okay, so in addition to sociological and psychological explanations, there's also moral justifications for why people pursue terrorism. And there's two kind of general settings that can give rise to moral justifications for violence. The first is when a group of people conclude that they've been morally wronged and that there's a powerful, immoral, or evil enemy arrayed against them. The enemy participates in betrayal, exploitation, violence, repression. So there's one group and they're oppressing and wronging this other group. The other setting is when you have a group of people, a group or people, they conclude that it possesses some kind of inherent moral. I have a hard time talking today. Possesses an inherent moral superiority over the enemy. Now, this can come from ideological convictions, ethno-national values, religious beliefs. The cause is holy, right? So therefore, they give themselves this sense of moral purity, which becomes the foundation for this simplified worldview of good and evil. Okay, no compromise is possible because you could not possibly compromise with evil, right? So terrorism becomes a legitimate option. And they arrive at this simplified version of good and evil through numerous ways. But once they do, the methods employed are justified because these are noble goals and noble objectives. Okay. Terrorists also oftentimes will envision that they're trying to achieve some form of utopia, which is a perfect version of society. So for these types of terrorists, any system is preferable to the one that they're currently in. And just the destruction of society is a justifiable goal to them. Now, what type of utopia they seek, depends on their particular ideological worldview. For radical leftists, they seek to reform and destroy the current society and replace it with a new and just society. Radical rightists seek to return, kind of to a time of perceived glory, which has been usurped or taken away or overtaken by some other group or culture. Regardless of the belief system, they uniformly believe that the promised good of these utopias outweighs their actions, and whatever ends justify the means that they decide to use. And finally, terrorists sometimes adopt codes of self-sacrifice, and they believe that these codes that they've adopted are superior to those who don't follow these particular codes of self-sacrifice. They derive these codes from their belief in their overwhelming justness of their cause, and they use these codes to justify their behavior then, because whatever they end up doing, their adherence to this code will cleanse them of any wrongdoing that they've done. All right, so stop there for this week. Be sure to read the chapter, complete your assignments. As always, let me know if you have questions, and I'll see you next week.